It was supposed to be a fun, harmless tradition. Every October, the pumpkin patch just outside of town became the place to be. Families came for the hay rides, couples strolled hand in hand through the fields, and kids darted between the pumpkins, searching for the perfect one to carve. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of cider and the sound of laughter. But this year, something was different. Something was wrong. It started small, an uneasy feeling, like eyes were watching me from somewhere in the thick tangle of vines. I brushed it off, convincing myself it was just the chill of autumn playing tricks on my mind. But as I stood in the field, surrounded by the gnarled, twisting pumpkin vines, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I could see it in the others too, the way they glanced over their shoulders, their smiles fading into uneasy frowns. The air was heavy, suffocating, and the laughter that usually filled the patch was replaced with a nervous silence. The first disappearance was shrugged off as a prank. A kid, maybe 13, had wandered too far into the patch and hadn't come back. His friends called for him, at first with playful teasing, but soon their voices took on a frantic edge. They searched, shouting his name until their voices were hoarse. But he was gone. It was like the earth had swallowed him whole. The adults tried to stay calm, murmuring reassurances that he'd just gotten lost and would turn up soon. But as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the field, that calm began to crack. And then the second person vanished. An older man this time, a regular who came every year to pick out the biggest pumpkin he could find. One minute he was there, haggling with the vendor, and the next, he was gone. No sound, no sign of struggle, just gone. Panic set in after that. People started running, pushing through the thick vines and massive pumpkins, desperate to get out. But the more they ran, the more the patch seemed to close in around them. The once familiar paths twisting into a labyrinth of gnarled roots and shadowed corners. The exit seemed to slip further away with every step, and the pumpkins, those carved, grinning jack-o'-lanterns, seemed to watch us with malicious glee, their flickering candlelight casting grotesque shadows that danced in the dark. It was then that we realized the true horror of what we were dealing with. The patch wasn't just a field of pumpkins. It was alive. The vines moved, coiling and tightening like snakes around anyone who got too close. The pumpkins seemed to swell, their carved faces warping into expressions of twisted rage. And the ground beneath our feet, it pulsed like a heartbeat, slow and deep, vibrating through the earth. The screams started soon after. One by one, people were dragged down into the dirt, their cries muffled as the earth swallowed them whole. I saw it happen. The ground would split open, the vines dragging them down, and then it would close again, leaving nothing behind but disturbed soil and a fresh pumpkin growing in their place. The patch was feeding on us. I'm not sure how many of us were left by the time we found the old barn at the edge of the patch. It was half rotted, leaning precariously to one side, but it was shelter. A few of us made it inside, slamming the door shut behind us. We huddled together, listening to the rustling of the vines outside, the creaking of the barn as the wind howled through the cracks. And then, just when we thought we were safe, the door started to splinter, the wood groaning as something outside pressed against it. That's when we heard the voice, low, gravelly, and full of malice. It came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the walls of the barn, making our skin crawl. "You can't escape!" it whispered, the words dripping with venom. "You're already mine." The door burst open and what stood there was no longer human. Its skin was the color of rotting pumpkins, eyes glowing with a sickly orange light, and its mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin. The stench of decay filled the air as it took a step forward, its hand reaching out, fingers like twisted roots, ready to claim its next victim. The barn became a cacophony of screams and the sound of splintering wood as the creature lunged. I ran, not knowing where I was going, just knowing I had to get out. But as I fled into the night, I realized with a sinking horror that the pumpkin patch was everywhere. The vines were crawling out of the ground, weaving through the trees, blocking my path at every turn. The jack-o'-lanterns were watching me, their flickering grins growing wider with every step. I tripped and fell, the breath knocked out of me as I hit the cold, hard ground. When I looked up, the creature was standing over me, its grin impossibly wide, eyes glowing with a hunger that made my blood run cold. And that's when I knew there was no escape. The cold earth pressed against my back as I stared up at the thing looming over me, its grotesque form silhouetted against the night sky. Its grin stretched wider, impossibly wide, as if it could devour me whole. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a desperate plea to escape. But there was nowhere to go. The vines were everywhere, curling and twisting like living chains, trapping me in this nightmare. Just as its hand, those gnarled, twisted fingers reached for me, a loud crack echoed through the air. The creature flinched, its glowing eyes flickering as if the sound had hurt it. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what had happened. One of the other survivors had grabbed a thick branch and struck the creature across its back, the force of the blow driving it away from me. "Run!" a voice shouted, sharp with terror. My legs responded before my mind could catch up, scrambling to my feet and bolting into the darkness. Behind me, the creature roared, a sound that vibrated through the earth and sent a chill down my spine. I didn't dare look back. I just ran, weaving through the thick underbrush, the branches clawing at my clothes like the fingers of the dead. I could hear them, the others. Their footsteps pounded the earth, breath ragged and labored as they pushed themselves to keep going. We were a scattered, desperate group, driven by nothing but pure, unbridled fear. The pumpkin patch was all around us now, the vines reaching out like tendrils of a malevolent force determined to drag us back into its hellish embrace. Somewhere ahead, a scream tore through the night. It was cut off abruptly, the silence that followed more terrifying than the scream itself. I pushed myself harder, adrenaline surging through my veins as I realized that we were being hunted, picked off one by one. In the distance, I spotted a faint glimmer of light. It flickered through the trees like a beacon, and I latched onto it with a desperate hope. The barn. It had to be the barn. Maybe, just maybe, we could regroup, find some way to fight back. But even as the thought crossed my mind, I knew how futile it was. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't just some mindless killer. It was something far worse, something that fed on fear and death. The light grew closer, the outline of the barn coming into view. It was old, dilapidated, the roof sagging in the middle, but it was shelter. I reached the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I pushed it open. The interior was dark, the only light coming from a few small gaps in the wooden walls where the moonlight seeped through. The air inside was thick with dust and the smell of rot. A few of the others were already there, huddled together, their faces pale and haunted. I could see the fear in their eyes, the same fear that gripped my own heart. We were trapped, cornered like rats, and the predator was closing in. "There's no way out," one of them whispered, his voice trembling. "It's going to kill us all." "We have to fight," another argued, his tone edged with desperation. "We can't just sit here and wait to die." I wanted to agree, to believe that there was something we could do. But the truth hung in the air between us, heavy and undeniable. This thing, this evil that had taken over the pumpkin patch, wasn't something we could fight with sticks and stones. It was something far older, far darker than any of us could comprehend. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the barn's walls. The creature was out there, somewhere in the dark, waiting, watching. I could feel its presence, a suffocating weight pressing down on us, making it hard to breathe. The jack-o'-lanterns outside flickered, their twisted faces casting long, grotesque shadows across the field. I could almost hear them laughing, a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down my spine. And then, just as we thought the night couldn't get any worse, the floor beneath us began to tremble. At first, it was just a slight vibration, something you could mistake for the wind. But then it grew stronger, more violent, until the entire barn was shaking, the wooden beams creaking under the strain. "What the hell is happening?" someone shouted, panic rising in their voice. Before anyone could answer, the ground beneath us split open with a deafening crack, a jagged line tearing through the center of the barn. The force of it knocked us off our feet, sending us sprawling onto the hard, splintered wood. I tried to stand, but the floor was shifting, sliding, pulling us toward the gaping chasm that had opened in the middle of the barn. Out of the darkness below, something began to emerge. At first, it was just a shadow, an inky blackness that seemed to seep up from the earth itself. But as it rose, it took form. Something massive, something monstrous. The smell hit us first, the stench of decay and rot so thick it made my eyes water. Then came the sound, a low guttural growl that rumbled through the barn, making the walls shudder. The shadow took shape, and what emerged from the darkness was worse than anything I could have imagined. It wasn't just one creature, it was many, faces twisted in agony, bodies fused together in a nightmarish mass of flesh and bone. Eyes stared out at us from every angle, glowing with a sickly, unnatural light. We scrambled back, trying to get away, but the barn was small, and there was nowhere to go. The mass of bodies slithered and writhed, reaching out with twisted limbs, fingers like claws scraping against the wood as it dragged itself toward us. The others screamed, their voices filled with pure terror. I felt it too, that cold, paralyzing fear that seeped into my bones. I could see the vines outside the barn, pressing against the walls, closing in on us from all sides. The pumpkins, those grinning jack-o'-lanterns, seemed to watch with glee, their twisted faces glowing brighter as the creature advanced. And then, just as the first of the twisted limbs reached out to claim its next victim, the barn door slammed shut with a force that rattled the entire structure. The creature paused, its many eyes narrowing as if in confusion. The growl deepened, more aggressive now as it tried to push forward, but something was holding it back. It was the vines. They were wrapping around the creature, pulling it back toward the chasm. The ground shook violently as the creature struggled, but the vines tightened their grip, dragging it down into the darkness. We didn't wait to see what happened next. As soon as the creature was distracted, we bolted for the door, throwing it open and sprinting out into the night. But even as I ran, I knew this wasn't over. The barn was just a temporary refuge. The pumpkin patch was still alive, still hunting us. And whatever force had pulled that creature back into the earth was still out there, watching, waiting. We didn't look back. We couldn't. All we could do was keep running, knowing that the real terror was yet to come. The night air was frigid as we fled from the barn, our breath visible in the cold as we tore through the fields. The dark tendrils of the pumpkin patch seemed to stretch endlessly, weaving into a labyrinth that swallowed any sense of direction. The vines moved unnaturally, slithering across the ground like living serpents, blocking paths that had been cleared just moments before. The further we ran, the more the world around us twisted, until it felt like we were trapped in a nightmare we couldn't wake from. The screams of those who had been caught echoed through the night, a constant reminder that we were being hunted. The jack-o'-lanterns scattered throughout the patch had grown more grotesque, their carved faces contorting into expressions of twisted malevolence. Their eyes glowed with an eerie, pulsing light, and it felt as though they were guiding the evil that stalked us, laughing at our terror. We were a small group now, just a handful of us left. The others had been taken, dragged into the earth by the monstrous thing that lurked beneath the patch, or worse, consumed by it. The survivors were all strangers to me, but in that moment, we were bound by our shared fear, our mutual desperation to survive. We didn't speak, there was no need. The terror was written on our faces, in the way we clung to each other, searching for any sign of safety. As we stumbled through the twisting vines, we spotted something up ahead. A tall, crooked scarecrow standing at the edge of a clearing. It was dressed in tattered rags, its straw-stuffed body swaying gently in the wind. Its head was a rotting pumpkin, the carved eyes staring down at us with a sinister grin. But it was the only thing that seemed remotely human in this place. So we approached, hoping it might mark the end of the patch, or at least provide some clue to our escape. But as we got closer, something strange happened. The ground beneath the scarecrow began to shift, the soil churning as if something was moving just below the surface. We stopped in our tracks, fear gripping us as we watched the earth crack open at the scarecrow's feet. A low, rumbling growl echoed from the depths, and then the ground erupted, sending dirt and debris flying into the air. From the chasm emerged a figure. A man, or at least something that had once been a man. His skin was a sickly pale, his eyes sunken and black. He was dressed in a farmer's overalls, the fabric stained with blood and dirt. But the most horrifying thing was his mouth. It was sewn shut with thick black thread, the stitches pulling his lips into a grotesque smile. He stood there, swaying slightly, his head tilted at an unnatural angle as he stared at us. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The air around us grew heavy, thick with the scent of decay. The scarecrow's head, that rotten pumpkin, slowly turned to face us, its eyes glowing with that same sickly light as the jack-o'-lanterns. The man took a step forward, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Without warning, the vines shot out from the ground, wrapping around our ankles, pulling us down. We screamed, struggling against their grip, but it was useless. The vines tightened, dragging us closer to the man, closer to that thing that had crawled out of the earth. The man reached out, his hands gnarled and twisted, fingers like claws as they brushed against my face. In that moment, something in the air changed. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and the jack-o'-lantern's eyes began to flicker, their light dimming. The man froze, his head snapping toward the scarecrow, as if he had heard something we couldn't. And then, with a sudden violent jerk, the scarecrow's body tore apart, the rags and straw exploding outward as something emerged from within. It was the creature from the barn, or what was left of it. But it had changed, twisted by the patch into something even more monstrous. Its body was a mass of rotting flesh and tangled vines, its face an amalgamation of the screaming, contorted faces of those it had consumed. It moved with a terrible, predatory grace, the ground beneath it rotting away as it advanced. The man, the one with the sewn-shut mouth, let out a muffled scream, his eyes wide with terror. He tried to back away, but the creature was too fast. It lunged forward, the vines snapping out and wrapping around the man, dragging him into its mass. The sound of bones snapping and flesh tearing filled the air, and we watched in horror as the man was consumed, his body dissolving into the writhing mass of the creature. The creature turned its attention to us, its many eyes narrowing as it slowly advanced. The jack-o'-lanterns flickered wildly, their grins widening as if in anticipation. The vines tightened around us, pulling us closer to the creature, closer to our doom. But then, just as all hope seemed lost, a loud, piercing scream cut through the night. A scream that didn't belong to any of us. It was high-pitched, almost inhuman, and it seemed to come from the heart of the patch itself. The creature froze, its eyes widening in shock as the scream echoed across the field. The vines loosened their grip, and for a brief moment, we were free. I didn't waste any time. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the nearest person and pulling them up. We ran, stumbling and tripping over the uneven ground, our breath ragged in our throats. The creature roared behind us, a sound of pure, unbridled rage, but it didn't follow. Something was holding it back, something that terrified even it. As we ran, I glanced back just once to see what had stopped it. The pumpkin patch was glowing now, a sickly green light emanating from the vines and pumpkins. The creature was retreating, its massive form sinking back into the earth, but its eyes never left us, watching with a burning hatred that sent chills down my spine. We ran until our legs gave out, collapsing in a heap at the edge of the patch. The light from the barn was visible in the distance, but it was dim now, barely more than a flicker. We were outside the patch, but we weren't safe. Not yet. The horror we had witnessed, the evil that lurked in that field, it wasn't finished with us. And deep down, I knew that whatever force had stopped the creature wasn't on our side. It was something older, something darker, and it was waiting. The real terror was still to come.